founders that do not experience the problems themselves almost certainly cannot be trusted with then scaling the solution. I needed to throw myself into the other side. Even my myopic worldview, I thought, oh, Uber Eats or Grab Food or Go Food, that works perfectly for the merchant. Only when I started my own kitchen, selling lots of brands from a small space on the Gold Coast during COVID, did I understand the chaos that I had inadvertently unleashed on the world.
Today on The First, we have Chris Withers from Klikit, who, for someone his age, has already had an incredible career spanning across Australia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Bangladesh. Every time I come away from a conversation with Chris, I feel energized, and no doubt you will too. As you will hear, his passion for work and life is truly infectious, with insights and takeaways that feel like guiding lights of wisdom from someone well beyond his years. This is a story of grit and resilience, marked with significant personal setbacks. This is an incredible, vulnerable, but insightful story that I encourage all founders to listen to. Enjoy.
Chris, welcome to The First podcast. Really stoked to have you here today. You're just one of those people that when I have conversations with, I come away from them feeling really energized. I think you're one of those people that have a super infectious personality. So it's great to talk to you today. I think first, maybe to set some context, do you want to maybe talk through what actually is Klikit, commercial model, markets, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for having me. I think, Klikit is by definition an all-in-one software serving smart merchants. And so, we started this business because we think that there's an awesome opportunity, not only across Southeast Asia, but North Asia as well, to build value-added software across lots of different pieces of the value chain. And so what we aim to do is we're providing services such as online order aggregation, menu management, marketing, CRM, MPOS, and more for all one low, affordable subscription price per month.
Awesome. And I think maybe just to start from the beginning of your journey, right? You've had quite an interesting journey thus far. Let's maybe talk through your background, where you're from. Obviously, you're Australian by the sounds of it, and maybe talk through a bit more of your upbringing.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the thick accent gave it away, but we've all got the same one. So amongst friends. Yep. I grew up in a city called the Gold Coast in Australia. It's a very famous kind of beach town. I think it's a bit
paradise.
Surfers paradise. Probably a bit more than a town now, as it's been growing over the last couple of years. But, grew up there, went to school there. I think it's a phenomenal place. It's a very, amazing, beautiful part of the world. And truly, when people refer to Australia as the lucky country, I think Gold Coast always comes, top of the list. It's absolutely
not biased.
Is this a tourism sell job at the moment?
It might be. Tourism Australia, I'm open for work. But grew up there, went to school down there, and then was fortunate enough to go to university in Brisbane, the University of Queensland, something that we share in common, Ben, which is awesome. And then, was studying law and economics there at the time. And so, really sort of dived into this world of, I guess, looking at kind of finance, looking at how all these different pieces kind of fit together. But unfortunately found that law just simply wasn't for me.
When did you figure that out?
Probably 15 minutes into the first lecture of a 5.5-year dual degree.
Perfect.
Yeah, so recognised pretty quickly that law just simply wasn't going to be something for me long term to build a profession and build sort of a vocation in. And I think fundamentally that was driven by the fact that, in the law, you learn a lot of rules and value systems, and then your job is about how you apply those to novel facts and cases. But for me, I love to build things. I think even as a child, I had a huge obsession with Lego, right? I would see these pieces and I want to construct these, different towers and buildings and cityscapes and all these different things. And so you might be like, well, why didn't you become an architect? It's because I'm terrible at drawing. But, I really want to be creative is what I'm getting at. And I think that, 15 minutes into the first lecture at the UQ School of Law, I very quickly learned that this was not a creative profession. And so, I sort of still could see an immense value to studying law because I think that, when I reflect now on my time as a founder, law has been able to help me in terms of how I assess problems, how I view problems, and how I then, start to craft solutions. But fundamentally, I just knew that the job wasn't for me. And so, over the course of then my university career, I did things ranging from working in Big Four consulting, working investment banking internships, all of those sorts of things, just trying to figure it all out.
And maybe taking a step back even before university. I mean, did you grow up in an entrepreneurial household? Like, was that, did the spark start then, or did it start later on?
Yeah, absolutely not. So both my parents are doctors, and so they were very much of the kind of, the rigid sort of system. So for those listening to the podcast, in Australia, the system of medicine is a very sort of regimented one, right? You do really well at high school, you then sit an entrance exam, you then go to university. If you're successful, you get put into a medical program, do an undergraduate degree, then you technically do a master's, and then you sort of like kick off the track. But yeah, I think that I didn't really have any of that entrepreneurial exposure. And so, that was also kind of fascinating because my parents couldn't really give me much advice on a lot of this stuff. They knew a lot about medicine, and they were like, if you want to be a doctor, we can help you out a lot. And, one of my younger sisters is now a doctor, and I think that she, has been able to obviously learn a lot from my parents and sort of their background and context there. But for me, it was like, we can't really help you so much here, so good luck. And so the reason I even sort of went into law as opposed to medicine is that, I think growing up, I didn't really see myself as being a doctor. I just couldn't wrap my head around that again as a sort of future. And, my parents suggested, they were like, hey, you love to argue with us, and so maybe you should try and, make money arguing. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'll give law a shot.
I think just out of curiosity, given the journey that you've had thus far, was international growth on the agenda then, or was Asia on the agenda at that early stage?
Yeah, I think this is a great question from you, Alex, and one that I actually haven't probably talked much about in other kind of, contexts. So what was fascinating is that the school I went to on the Gold Coast, by year 6, they had a dual language program. So every student in the school had to pick a language. And so there were 2 languages available. There was French and there was Chinese. And so the school I went to, everyone obviously aspired to go on the French skiing holidays, and their parents were going on all these holidays. And so all of the kids signed up for French. And so I found myself in a room full of 8 students studying Chinese. And I actually do think that was one of the best pieces of advice my parents gave me. So, I was only 10 years old, starting to study Mandarin. And as part of that process, they actually took us on a school visit to China. And so, we were able to spend time in Beijing. We went to Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors are, and then also briefly spent some time in Shanghai. And I think that really was the first true taste of this kind of international.
What year was that? I mean, that must have been early 2000s,
a while ago,
right?
Yeah, it was. It was really early in the piece. So, it was sort of around that time the Beijing Olympics were happening, basically, or sort of just prior to that. And so, I think it was also a transformational time for China. So it was a really interesting and fascinating time to be involved in that space. And although my Mandarin today is very rusty, it's served me incredibly well throughout my professional life. And I think that it's something which, when people ask me, hey, what's been some of the biggest things I think, over the course of your life that have influenced your professional success, I think learning Chinese has almost certainly been up there.
And so that spark was started then of, hey, understanding the opportunity set in Asia, this immense tailwind that was kicking off. That then led to, at what point in university, when did you start to go, well, maybe I want to go spend time offshore? Or was it still, no, I'm going to work in Australia, I might move to Sydney, do the traditional thing?
Yeah, no, I think also another great question. And so China's also involved in this story too. So, we'll probably get onto a little bit more about how my professional career kind of played out. But when I was at UQ, given that I wasn't super fascinated by the law thing, I found myself spending a lot of time with co-curricular societies. And one in particular, which, still very happy to be able to support today, is the UQ Innovation and Entrepreneurship Society. And so they were actually running was kind of like a university co-funded trip to China again. And so, was able to go again to China, spend some time there, meet a bunch of companies. At the time, we got to meet a bunch of the companies that were sort of under the Alibaba parent organization and do a lot of transformational work for them as part of almost like a university intensive. And so, I think that then crystallized things that I had seen and done, as a child, but really kind of thinking through, well, okay, if we look at in particular Australia, where Australia sits. I think for the longest time, people have always said, oh, we're close to America, we're close to Europe because, ethnically we're like a lot closer. But the reality is like, it's not our backyard. There's all these like fantastic, amazing nations that sit in our own backyard. And I think that there's not enough people, certainly in Australia, thinking about what our role will be over not just like, the next decade, but certainly like the next century in terms of how that plays out.
Awesome. And I think like you had an interesting story, and as you mentioned, you didn't like naturally go to do like the 2 years in corporate, learn to hate it, and then dive into tech or dive into startup. You actually kind of transitioned pretty early. And I think there's like a pretty cool story around like you having this gray area between like completing your degree and then moving into Uber. Do you want to talk through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely a pretty funny story, or at least I think it's funny. So, being at university, I was obviously the beneficiary of two educated parents and a great household. But they did tell me, hey, you've got to go get a job. Sorry. Welcome to capitalism. You've got to go bring in your own money and you've got to start paying for stuff. And so, I'd had sort of little jobs here and there. Before that, I was doing some tutoring work and stuff like that. But I hadn't really, besides these kind of summer vacation internships or real kind of, focused opportunities, I hadn't really dived into kind of like quote unquote corporate. And so at the time, I was still wrangling whether or not I wanted to do that and, came across an advertisement for a job. It was pretty nondescript. It was on seek.com.au. It was like, we're looking for a university intern, someone smart, driven, hungry, ambitious. I looked at that and thought, wow, this job's made for me. This is my role that someone's put up here. And so, I applied and, I received confirmation. And I remember, they sent me these details. They said, hey, come to this address, turn up and be ready. We'll trial you out on your first day.
What year is this?
This is 2015, early 2015.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And so, I looked at the address, thought, oh, it's a bit funky, but didn't really think much of it. And so, the day rolled around. I dressed up in my probably ill-fitting suit. I had my, my CV ready, my sheets of paper. And I turned up to the address and it was like a mechanic's garage. And it was about a line of 100 cars extending like all the way down the street, like wrapped around the block. And so I've turned up and this mechanic comes out the front and he's like, you must be Chris. And I was like, that's me, yeah. And he's like, why are you dressed like that? And I was like, oh, I thought, I'm here for the job interview. I'm here to really kind of, impress you and do all these things. And he sort of just ignored me, grabbed the sheets of paper I had, and he was like, what's an econometrics? And I was like, it's
a great question.
Statistical thing. It's trying to predict, market modeling. And he's like, don't understand it at all. Anyway, not important. He said, welcome to the job. We've got 100 vehicles to inspect today and we need to get this done before close of day because that's what the clients asked for. So I said, okay, let's get it done. How are we doing it? And he said, well, here's a clipboard and some pen and some paper. You go around, you're recording all the details in these cars. So we're talking VIN numbers, compliance plates, external damage, internal damage, all that sort of stuff. And I said, whoa, it's a lot of cars. It's a lot of paper, a lot of clipboards. I said, you don't happen to have any laptops or anything like lying around, do you? Or even better, some tablets. He said, yeah, I think we might have some, like in the reception, playing mobile games on them or something. So I went in there and I asked the receptionist, I said, hey, have you got some mobile tablets? She handed some over and I pretty quickly rigged up just like a simple Google form and a sheet, right? So fill in the form. Once you complete the form, populates a row in a Google sheet. And so I was able to sort of mimic the sort of questionnaire that he had given me. So had 2 or 3 tablets, showed the other mechanics how to use it. And I said, hey, I think we can get this done a lot quicker. So sure enough, we started and yeah, we were flying. We were off to a really good rate and we got it all done by the end of the day. And so, I was pretty chuffed. I thought I'd really improved this business and, thought I'd made a great first impression. Yeah, value add, exactly. And I turned to the mechanic and I said, right, so I guess I work for your garage now. And he was like, no, man, I'd never hire you. And I was like, oh, okay, well, who do I work for? And he said, oh, you work for the illegal taxi company called Uber. Welcome to the job. And so that was really how I got my first true job. And at that time, I was then working as an intern for what was Uber Australia Proprietary Limited. And at that time, what made things interesting was that, Uber technically at that point operated in a legal grey area. I still recall my my training. And so that made things then very difficult with the, Faculty of Law, because in Australia, again, for those who are watching the podcast, in order for you to practice law in Australia, you must pass something called the Ethics Committee. And as part of that, passing the Ethics Committee, your behaviour is evaluated. And so I had made this fatal flaw, or what people told me was a fatal flaw, in working for this grey company, because I simply wouldn't pass an ethics committee.
And this was UberX, right? This was hadn't yet been acknowledged and approved in a regulator sense.
100%.
Yeah.
This was the P2P ride-sharing model. This was, crosshairs of every Australian politician. The taxi lobby hated them. The politicians hated them. But the consumers didn't. And so it was a fantastic opportunity for me because, I slipped into this kind of internship role and was able to really throw myself into something that was growing at the time. And then in terms of where that then crystallized into a full-time role, back then, because it was UberX and it was still very much in this grey space, the Brisbane team back then was incredibly small. We had a general manager and at that point, we had one operations manager. And we actually had a job out for a role called an operations coordinator, which, in Uber speak was called an OpsCo. And it was a guy who was meant to start as Brisbane's first OpsCo. He had signed the contract, and the day before he was meant to start, he walked into our Constant Street office and he tore up the contract. He said, "Hey, I've got cold feet here. I can't do this with this business, and I've got a role at CBRE, so I'm going to go take that." And so he just walked out. And so at that point, the general manager kind of popped his head up and, he was stressing out. And he goes, "That bloke, he's here all the time." And I was like, "Hey, how you going? I'm Chris. I'm one of the interns." And he said, "Hey, man, what do you think about analytics? You're pretty good at that stuff. You're a bit of a whiz bang on the spreadsheets." I said, "Oh, could give it a go." And so, I sat Uber's analytics test, did well enough, and they offered me a full-time role. But at the time, I hadn't completed my degree. And so, Uber, and again, very grateful that they did this, said, "Hey, we're a company that focuses entirely on output. So if you can make it work and you can deliver on your output, then what you do outside of work hours, that's not important to us. So you have the choice and the chance to make this work." And at that time, the way Uber was and the way I viewed it, sometimes in life you get these 1 in a million opportunities.
Yeah.
This kind of convergence or confluence of all these factors. And, I think that there'll probably be some people out there listening who have had these moments happen where they say no and it radically changes your path and direction. And so I knew if I said no, this would probably be something I look back on with regret. And so despite it being uncomfortable, despite it being a grey company, despite it basically making my law degree worthless, I thought this is a risk, but there's enough of an opportunity here that if this goes really well, I think I've found something I can sort of throw myself into. And, the rest is history.
Awesome. I think maybe just provide some context on what were some of the things that you were working on in those early days of Uber, because you obviously transitioned to the Uber Eats model later on, but What was it you were specifically looking at early on?
Yeah, and so I think it's fascinating because when I look back on stuff that we were doing in the Brisbane market, when I started my career, this is stuff that I still do today now with Klikit, right? So when I first turned up Uber Brisbane, we were trying to figure out how to start the business. Basically, the way that Travis Kalanick ran the company is every city was its own startup.
Yeah.
And so, the GM was effectively the founder. He would hire in a smart team around him or her. And then, from that point, you would work on solving problems relevant to your market in order to unlock this kind of exponential growth that Uber has now become famous for. And so in the early days, there was a lot of stuff that was really just unsexy. You're running onboarding sessions for drivers. You're, providing your personal WhatsApp or your mobile when drivers run into technical issues. You're building customer promotions, and maybe sometimes you're printing them on cards and standing out the front of nightclubs and handing them out, right? There was no task or no role that was beneath anybody, right? Everyone was there, rolling the sleeves up and getting stuff done. And so I think in those early days, it really was about how do we unlock kind of quote unquote product market fit, right? We knew in Australia that the taxi industry had this sort of long-standing monopoly and the customers were upset with it. They didn't like the quality of service. They didn't like how sometimes the drivers behaved. They didn't like the costs, right? And so we thought, hey, there's an interesting opportunity to provide a lower cost, product of better quality by using kind of P2P ride sharing drivers. And so that's really, the thesis we entered the market with. And happy to say that, when I joined the team, they were doing, I think, 20,000 trips a week. And within 3 to 6 months, we were doing about 200,000 to 300,000 trips a week.
Wow.
So huge scale.
What's interesting is I think there's a lot of perceptions even now, and there's there's TV shows about it, and Uber's become famous for, I guess, the culture that it sort of instilled in a lot of people that came out of it. Right, there's been a bit of a mafia that's emerged from it. And if you think about it now, like what you're saying, the types of traits that instilled in you, which is there's no job too small. The idea that it's all about outcomes, not effort, right? Starting, still working full time when you're at university. Would you say that was a foundational moment in the journey that you're on now? Like, that sounds like it was.
Yeah, almost like 100% and unequivocally. I think that there are a lot of parts of Uber's culture that were terrible and toxic, and those have been litigated and discussed at length in other pieces of media, which people can check out. But fundamentally, there were some awesome and amazing things. And I think, one thing that Travis and certainly the early employees were able to do, certainly David Rorsheim, who was effectively running the Australian market alongside Mike Abbott, Simon Rossi, they were able to just find incredible people. And really, if I was to actually distill down what the one key thing is out of people who worked at early Uber, it is this incredible level of accountability. It's not necessarily intelligence. It's not necessarily like abstract problem solving. It's this high degree of accountability that if you say you will do something, you will go and do it. And doing that frequently enough, right? I don't think there was ever a day where we went from 0 to 50,000, right? It was actually, this kind of consistent, controlled effort of a number of small steps that progressively added up over time. But yeah, I think that it crystallized something in me that really gave me that, I guess almost gave me a taste of what being a founder could be like. And It was a bit like a drug then that I knew I had to have at some point. But I also acknowledged, being at Uber, that I just had so much still to learn.
And so you're at Uber, you've had, really good success early on in the Brisbane market, but you didn't stay in Australia for that long, right? I mean, there was other opportunities that started to pull you back up into Asia. How did that transition happen? Because, I mean, that was not common as I understand it inside of Uber at the time. You sort of were tied to a city, you grew senior in that city, right? And you sort of took a different path. How did that come about?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the first thing, to note about Uber Australia is that it was an incredible exporter of talent. I think, the Australian market and the way it unfolded, it was quite fortunate in the sense that, there was very little competition. Obviously, that's being discussed right now. But I think that, what that led to is it led us to an ability to create a really great product, but more importantly, great processes. And so, I was only in the Brisbane team for probably about 6 months. And then I was actually relocated to Sydney to start a new team, which was called the Regional Operations Team. And so it marked an important transition in Uber where how do you move from each city as a startup to then starting to scale processes and thinking about this at a more sort of distributed level. And so I was able to do that really effectively out of Sydney. I was handling sort of driver growth and onboarding. And so I was doing a lot of that stuff and building a lot of processes and using a lot of tools. And then the transition period happened when, ride sharing became legalized in Australia. And that coincided, interestingly, at the same time that we had sold the Uber business in China. And when we sold the Uber business in China, there are a couple of key figures, in particular, a guy named Alan Penn, a guy named Sam Gelman, and another guy named Mike Brown, who was the RGM of Southeast Asia. And on selling the China business, they came to Singapore and they said, hey, we've seen this business in China called Meituan, and it's unbelievable. It's a food delivery. And then at that point, they just started doing grocery. They don't do ride sharing. They don't do transport. And it's a fantastic business. And we think we need to start it. And so, at that time, Alan got enough significant buy-in that he said, hey, we want to launched this thing called Uber Eats. And so Jason Droege, another senior leader at Uber, had sort of started this as an experiment in Toronto, actually. But it was the only market that was operating this very small scale experiment. And so, Alan went to Jason and said, hey, I think there's a huge opportunity for this in Asia. I'll assemble a team and I'll get things moving. Unfortunately for Alan, at the time, everyone still wanted to work on the ride-sharing product. Travis was obsessed with the ride-sharing product, in particular Uber Pool, right? And so nobody wanted to work on Uber Eats. They thought it was like an awful business. There's a hilarious segment where, Travis was on with Stephen Colbert. And, I think he gave him a pretty hard time. He ridiculed him. He said, Travis, how can you think, cold burritos in taxis is a good business model? And, it really kind of stumped Travis at the time. And so, there was a lot of just this like stigma around the Uber Eats business. But for me, I had viewed it as such a fascinating opportunity, right? To go from a two-sided marketplace model to a three-sided model where, previously in ride sharing, you have customer, driver, and Uber acts as the intermediary in the marketplace there. All of a sudden now you have customer, merchant, driver. And that, like by its sheer nature, creates a whole lot of what I thought and still think at the time is fun complexity. And so, yeah, I contacted Mike, I contacted Alan. I said, I'm currently working in the Australian regional operations team. I would love to be able to join you on this journey. I don't care about titles. I don't care about roles. I just want to solve really fascinating, hard problems in a market which I think will be the future. And Alan turned around to me then, at that time, 22. He said, you'll be the head of growth. I'll see you in Singapore next week. And so, packed all my bags, packed up my life in Australia, and came to Singapore to start the journey.
That's awesome. You also mentioned, we had an earlier conversation around like that actual tour, right? You went on a parade around North Asia and then Southeast Asia. What did that look like and what were some of the learnings from there? Because there was obviously some of these kind of established Chinese players within this market. But there was also kind of like the up and coming, like the Grabs, the Gojeks of the world. Like what was the context of that?
Yeah. So I was really fortunate at the time. Alan had brought in another senior leader from Uber to manage what was effectively the regional Eats team. And that individual was Tomaso Rodriguez, who is now the current CEO of Talabat in the Middle East. Yep. And, was a fantastic manager. I think Tomaso really understood that you had to be in these markets to see the conditions, to really try and understand the problems. And so as part of his sort of first actions in assembling the team, he really mandated that we go to all of these different countries and see, how the restaurant industry or how food generally operated. And so, again, to your point, Alex, I think it was fascinating because I did get to see some of these very nascent players at the time. Grab at that point didn't have a food delivery business. They had decided they weren't going to do that. Gojek had a food delivery business, but it was very different than what it is currently today. It was what we call an over-the-top model. So instead of routing orders to merchants directly, you would route orders to drivers. And drivers would just turn up at a shop and place an order and pay with their own money.
I remember that.
Yeah. And then collect from the customer, right? So these things were almost like mind-bending or mind-blowing because, as a small town, by Asian standards, boy from Australia who was only really used to the local pizza shop or the Thai restaurant doing their own kind of delivery, I was seeing all of these like marketplace mechanics like unfold at speed and scale. And so, wrapping my head around that, making new friends in all these different markets, I think it really set that kind of interest or that passion ablaze in me that I thought that there was just so much opportunity in this space.
And what does head of growth exactly do back then? Like what were you actually focused on?
Yeah, so it was a jack of all trades, master of some.
Yeah.
And so, I think predominantly my responsibility was if we go into a country, the first thing that needed to be worked out was what is required to localize the product in order to get it to function, right? So I can't just speak in hypotheticals on this. I need to give the audience a real example. One real example, Japanese addresses. I don't know how much the two of you have in experience with Japanese addresses, but if you've ever visited Japan and you've tried to use Google Maps, typically a lot of Japanese addresses, they exist in a certain sort of format where they have multiple numbers split by hyphens and then a designator. And so typically a Japanese address can refer to 3 buildings. And so additional information must be collected. Otherwise, you just end up with these undelivered orders. And so that's what happened. When we launched the first version of Uber Eats in Japan, we used the same sort of American address system, right? Typically built for American suburbia where things are pretty clear, 723 Evergreen Drive, perfect, turn up, make it happen. But in Japan, all of a sudden, it was chaos. Drivers are calling us, drivers are calling customers. They're like, I can't find this person. The address is just like this. I'm now standing in between 3 buildings, roaming around with, a bowl of yakisoba that's going cold. Are you going to pay me? Who's going to pay me? Will the customer be mad? You pile that on then with a whole lot of interesting cultural nuance in Japan, right? Around service, around quality. Ooh.
You're not winning.
You're not winning. It becomes a mess. So that was the first thing that I was responsible for, working directly with the teams in San Francisco to understand which pieces and sort of components needed to be localized. And then from that point, we then sort of turn our attention to acquisition, right? So if anyone's taken the time to read Cold Start Problem by Andrew Chen, he talks a lot about sort of kicking off these flywheels, and he does a great job sort of, I guess deconstructing the Uber approach to that. But fundamentally with Uber Eats, there's sort of 2 things you need to guarantee. The first is that there's restaurants on the platform. No restaurants, no food, right? So you need some level of merchant selection, and you need that across the board of cuisines. You can't just have all American restaurants or all Japanese restaurants, right? You need to have this mixture so the customer has choice in the marketplace. Then the second thing you need drivers, because if you can't get the food to someone, then you're also in trouble, right? You're also not winning. And so, as part of that process, I would work deeply with local teams on merchant acquisition strategies and then driver acquisition strategies to maintain this kind of like what we would have to call an atomic network, the same way Andrew Chen talks about it, right? What is the minimum number of restaurants, minimum number of drivers, also then bounded possibly by geography and time to make this marketplace work? And so I got to do that for all of these cities across the region. And, it's a fantastically complicated problem. And we often got it wrong. I remember when we launched Uber Eats in India, we launched in Mumbai. We got it incredibly wrong in terms of the geofence that we decided to launch. And we effectively had to wind back our geographic coverage, which is something at Uber we weren't used to. That was not a thing very common at Uber, that we would wind back geographic coverage. But we had to in order to maintain marketplace sort of, I guess, security and scalability. So yeah, that was sort of, I guess, my key kind of responsibilities. And then as the market matured and developed over time, then I would get more into the customer side of the equation. So how do we build promotions, or how do we acquire customers, or how do we change a customer from being a ride-sharing customer to being an Uber Eats customer? So I got to work on basically everything, and that's why I love the role.
So you've been in Uber, an increasing level of responsibility and more regional mandate. But you're now in Singapore, and as we now know, Uber doesn't exist in Singapore anymore, right? Talk us through how that comes about, right? Because knowing people that, were in the organization at the time, pretty interesting to be acquired by what at the time would have seemed like a regional upstart, right? So, how did you find out about it? How was that process? How do you maintain resiliency with a team that feels like they're getting, maybe at the time a feeling where we're kind of getting chewed up by someone who we felt we were beating?
Yeah. And I think that was like a very difficult time at Uber. And I think that it was one that was very understated by our counterparts in North America and Europe, because, I think that there was, again, more of a cultural nuance in Asia. People who had signed up for jobs at Uber in Asia, if Uber was operating in that grey space, that carries a lot more cultural connotations with your family, with your friends, all of these other different things. And I think that was probably the most underappreciated part by our counterparts in North America. That people had really kind of put their own social and personal capital on the line to build this business.
Right?
Yeah. And so, when we got acquired, I think a few of us who were sitting, toward or at least closer to the management team, we had sort of started to read some of the tea leaves that something was happening. And I think, overall, this region is incredibly difficult for businesses to succeed. And I think that, it is 100% worth mentioning that I think, Anthony Tan has done an incredible job, basically operating this business across so many different markets. In fact, when I do what I do today, I look to him for a lot of like inspiration. And I think that that's certainly not understated. I think that he was able to do something that even to this day, really almost no one else has been able to do in Asia.
No, with the exception of maybe a Shopee Lazada, it's really those three, right, that have conquered the true regional Southeast Asian story.
Yeah, 100%. And so, when we noticed it happening, we started to really get that kind of that pushback, right? That you were sort of talking about. People, how do you come to work every day and tell people to keep fighting when you know that the bell's already been rung somewhere else? And so that was, I think, incredibly difficult. And then, when the deal happened and when it sort of like, commenced, I think the process could have been a lot better from both sides, both Uber and Grab. Everyone's trying to make the best of a difficult situation, but I think that the resultant kind of fallout was very difficult for a lot of people. And so, I viewed that deal as something that probably needed to happen. I think in the long run, Uber could not have competed, and I think that it made sense in terms of the deal that was done. But I do think that there could have been things done by Uber to ease the transition of that deal. It was very abrupt. It was very fierce. It was very in its old Uber style, despite Dara already then being the CEO of the company. And that I thought a little bit strange. And so, I obviously can't speak to his intentions or how he reflects on it, but I do think that there could have been a lot done differently to make that a better process.
What's interesting is off the back of that, you see this spread of talent come out of Uber, right? And they go to competitors, a lot go to Grab, a lot go to Gojek, and a number of other companies that are scaling at that time, mostly within Southeast Asia. You, on the other hand, take a bit of a different path, shall we say. Talk to us about that. Like, how do you end up relocating down to a market that, for a lot of us, we wouldn't see as a natural progression in a career that you were on at that point in time?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most fascinating pieces of the journey for me. So, just for context, after the Grab deal happened, I was contracted to still work and build the first food delivery business for Grab Food. And when that point concluded, I was given the opportunity to join Grab. I was also given the opportunity to transfer internally at Uber to somewhere like the US. But I felt like, the chapter still wasn't done in Asia. And so it was at that point that I was fortunate enough to meet Kevin Alui specifically, who's one of the co-founders at Gojek. And, he met me, we discussed GoFood at length and, what he thought about the emerging dynamics that would change in the region as a result of a Grab-Uber merger and how competition would become fiercer for Gojek. But at that time, he had also mentioned that there was an interesting side pocket bet that had been made in a country called Bangladesh for Gojek. And, that company was a company called Patao, which is, the Bengali word that means to send. And for all those listening, it's effectively like Gojek in Bangladesh. And he had told me, he had said, hey, I think you really should head out there and, there's stuff to fix, but I think it's an interesting opportunity and I think that it's a great chance to learn. And so, forever grateful to him for giving me that opportunity. But I did find myself sort of smack bang in the middle of Dhaka. And
Gulshan 1.
Gulshan 1, yeah. I actually lived in Chairmanbury, so, just on the outskirts there. And that was fascinating, right? I got to spend time in a country which, to this day, I am still hyper bullish on its future. Back then, I was working at Patao. I was doing fundraising for Patao. I would go into these meetings with investors. I would be in their big offices overlooking Marina Bay Sands, and I would be this strange Australian guy extolling how amazing this country was. Telling them that the GDP per capita will soon surpass India, that this fantastic market has such a fast-growing middle class. And I think most of them thought I was crazy, but this was back in 2018. Now the data proves, Bangladesh is rocketing up that curve of development. And I think, it's a place that'll always be special to me.
And tell us how you ended up coming back into Singapore again, because you've kind of come full circle to this point now.
Yeah, so after I, spent some time in Bangladesh and, got the company there to where I thought it needed to be, I then had a further sort of subsequent discussion with Kevin that said, hey, I think it's now time for me to step, back into the Indonesia business and, really try and understand how I can best add value here to support you guys in what you want to do. And so, at that point, that was sort of 2019, Indonesian leadership at Gojek was really sort of thinking about their options when it came to, are we going to list? Where are we going to list? What are we going to do? What needs to happen to get there? What sort of capital controls do we need to put in place? What sort of processes do we need to have? And so for me, that was where I got to work on what I guess we could frame as like big corporate. Because, I was fortunate enough to be close enough to the leadership team, the sort of executive leadership team at Gojek, where I got to see these decisions play out at the absolute highest level. And so, Kevin brought me back in. I was working with someone who I'd worked with previously at Uber, a guy named Andrew Brinson, who we haven't talked about him today in this interview, but he was my first buddy ever at Uber. So as part of our onboarding, we got paired up. Two guys with red hot personalities and really curly hair. And we've sort of like always stayed together working since, which is great. But I was in his team really working on a ton of different initiatives to get the business sort of where it needed to be before IPO. And so I guess that was then fascinating because I got to see, what does the tail end of a startup look like before it really makes the jump into a public company, and understanding how different that is to like a day zero that I got to see in Uber Brisbane. And so that juxtaposition, I think for me, was incredible.
Maybe taking a step out of the narrative for one moment, that time arc is only about 4 years, right? And so you've gone from, frankly, a kid coming out of university who's spent maybe some time outside of Australia, but from a cross-cultural sensitivity perspective, maybe not that much, sort of education and learning around it. And you've gone into roles where all of a sudden you're in multiple markets week after week. How do you deal with that? Like, how do you, your task at Uber was localization. You then go to Bangladesh and it's like, hey, you've got to go pitch Bangladesh and understand that at a very deep, culturally sensitive level. How do you figure that out? I mean, was it tough? Was it difficult to sort of, be able to build a framework that meant that you could be dropped into a market and build relationships?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think that it's certainly like not for everyone. This podcast isn't a segment about books, but if I was to recommend one that's pretty interesting on this topic, it's 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence, as many know, Lawrence of Arabia. And it talks a lot about the importance of cultural mimesis, the ability that you need to have to be able to let go of all these things you think are true or that you think that are anchored very deeply to your identity in order to assume somebody else's, to empathize, rationalize, and conduct yourself. And I think that, everything's hypothetical in books you read and, scenarios you run in your head until the rubber hits the road and it actually happens. That's when the practice really starts. And so I think my first practice or the first taste of that I got was really, that roadshow that you mentioned, Alex, right? Going around to all these different markets. Who am I? I'm some random Australian guy dropped in the middle of Taipei and I'm told to start a food delivery business. And I've got all these colleagues who, sure, we work for the same company, but they don't know me. I don't know them. I need to get their trust. I need to show them that I'm here to help, that I can act as a bridge to headquarters, right? And that I can help them further their goals. And so I think it was really difficult because you have to throw aside all of these previously held truths, I think, about a lot of different things. And so maybe, again, we talk, I think full circle will be an iterative theme in this podcast. In some cases, that's what you have to do in the law. You have to throw away all of these things like you think about something to really view a topic objectively and say, what are the fundamental truths here that I can work with? Not, they did that and that's wrong from like a moral standpoint. You have to, truly put yourself in a lawyer's shoes and say, hey, what are the facts? And so I think it was difficult, but it was something that I was fortunate enough through this sort of like, progressive chain in my career to get a lot of exposure of. And, when now people look at Klikit today and you look at the amount of markets we are in the time frame we are in, there is almost no way I would have been able to do that unless I had had this experience, unless I had built those networks, unless I had undergone those, cultural mimetic things, wouldn't have been able to do it.
So I think at this point you've got like a fair bit of pattern recognition across multiple roles, across multiple geos, and you're starting to what I think is kind of synthesize what potentially Klikit could look like. A lot of pain points, etc. Maybe do you want to walk through how you went through the decision-making process of starting Klikit at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the thesis fundamentally that I had for starting Klikit is that online food delivery will continue to be a growing segment. It will be huge. And I think that, my thesis has always been driven off the back of, I got to build effectively multiple versions of that in this region. But also then, I look at the way, for instance, children interact with devices and, the way that people are sort of generally tending towards, the time they spend online digitally. And my thesis was that that will continue to be a huge growing segment. And so as part of that process, I started thinking about, well, what are the tools that restaurants need to manage that space? And, while you use GrabFood or you might use FoodPanda or you might use Uber Eats, those themselves are contained platforms that operate independently. They operate in siloed fashions, right? If they were just the single app themselves and they had a monopoly, different story. But they do operate in these single silos. And so when I started looking at that, and then I was also looking at the current state of tooling that, merchants in hospitality had to manage this stuff, what I ended up finding was a lot of analog, clunky, poor point of sale systems that weren't really built for this kind of what I perceive to be digital or online future. And so there's two things in that. I think the first is how merchants will sell more online. And then I think the second is how merchants will want to sell more than one brand online. And, we could have a whole nother podcast about how that's interesting.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, the way that a lot of these systems that are operating, not only in this region, but globally, are that they think about a restaurant as being one single location that sells one single brand. And I've never been fascinated by that. I've been fascinated by one single location sells many, many brands. And so I wanted to understand this problem a lot more. And so for me to understand that, one thing that I've gone on the record of saying is I routinely tell investors and I routinely tell anyone who will listen, in fact, that founders that do not experience the problems themselves almost certainly cannot be trusted with then scaling the solution. And so I needed to throw myself into the other side. I had spent all this time building these fantastic marketplaces, driving millions of GMV and transactions. But from even my myopic worldview, I thought, Uber Eats or GrabFood or GoFood, that works perfectly for the merchant. They love that product. It's amazing. It brings them money. Only when I started my own kitchen, selling lots of brands from a small space on the Gold Coast during COVID, did I understand the chaos that I had inadvertently unleashed on the world. And so to just dive in a little bit quickly there, I was so fascinated by this thesis of selling online and selling different things online that I did want to experience it. And so I started my own ghost kitchen. And I did that because, one, my friends wouldn't let me use their kitchens. They were like, Chris, get out of
Rightly
here.
so, yeah.
You're a tech guy. You've got nothing to do with food. But two, I really needed to feel what it was like to be an operator of one of these platforms. And so within 6 months, I was selling 8 virtual brands from a single small location in Bailey Crescent in the Gold Coast. And, it was a fantastic opportunity for me because, I would work my day job at Gojek till around 10 p.m. AEST. And then from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., the graveyard shift, that was when I would be operating the kitchen, which actually worked really well because for those who are listening, on the Gold Coast, everything closes at 6 p.m. So, I was effectively able to build this kind of little monopoly niche on the graveyard delivery market. I was servicing brands to these aggregators. I was getting, food to customers. But at the same time, I was starting to learn about all these problems that existed in this space. And so the single largest of those was that, as I mentioned, I was selling 8 different brands across 4 platforms. 8 times 4 is 32. So I had 32 devices in my kitchen trying to manage all of these different brands. And I was one location. So you can imagine if I was someone as big as a KFC or as big as a Wendy's and I wanted to experiment with virtual brands, awful. And so I thought, there's a problem here that needs to be solved. My job is not done. I must go back to work.
Do you remember? So you've gone and found the problem statement. You've lived the problem statement. What's official day one of Klikit?
Yeah, so there's probably 2 official day ones. There's day one, which is when I lived the problem statement. And I distinctly recall what that was like. I remember launching the storefront on all of the different aggregators. And I think it was a 5:30 p.m. on a Friday. and orders started to roll in for fried chicken and chips, and this kind of wave hit me. I was like, what have I done? These are real customers who are buying product off a tech guy, and I was fortunate. I had my best friend helping me who had spent years in hospitality, and so he and I were running the kitchen. We were like this sort of dynamic duo. But again, there was a lot of ego death in that because, I had spent my time as a sort of VP, SVP at Gojek, and I was managing these big budgets, only to be in a small, tiny kitchen being yelled at by my Greek Australian best friend and being told how much of an idiot I was and how bad I was in the kitchen. So, an important day one, right?
Yep.
And I learned a lot. But then in terms of when did day one at Klikit really kind of like start, the way that I think about that, it was right, probably close to New Year's Day of 2021. And we had just like lodged a bunch of the paperwork with ACRA. And so it was really kind of drawing up, hey, what markets are we going to go focus on first? We're obviously headquartered in Singapore, but is that the right place to launch? It's probably not. And we had like a big session. We were all remote at that point, and we had like a big session for many hours, sort of like on a Google Meets, trying to like draw up all these different things. And, it was chaos because it's difficult when you're remote. I think that's probably been one of the hardest things about Klikit's journey, that we have a lot of distributed teams, not simply just because it's like a work from home is nice and cool and fun. It's actually more like we actually have country teams managing their own different countries. And so I remember thinking on that day one, ooh, Chris, this is going to be a difficult challenge. It's not an unknown challenge because it's what you worked with at Uber. But at Uber, you had the beneficiary of lots of capital, big offices, all of these different things, and now you don't have that. So you need to build trust. And if you cannot build trust, this will unravel very, very quickly because you won't be able to get the gas out of your remote teams that you need to ensure this thing survives. So that was like probably like my biggest realization then on sort of day one at Klikit.
The other thing I would say is like on top of building trust, you actually have to build product, right? And like, no offense to you, but looking at your profile, you definitely understand the pain point, like significant business experience in the domain, but you don't come across as like a technical founder, right? Like, what would be your rebuttal to that, given now that you've actually built something quite tangible within Klikit?
Yeah, so I think that you're on the money. I definitely am not a technical founder, but I think that my time at Uber and also at Patau and at Gojek had me work exceedingly close with engineers. Large scale system design, whether it was allocation systems, whether it was marketplace pricing systems, all these different things. So it was almost like when I reflect on this, I think I sort of like knew the answers to the homework. Like I'd kind of cheated at school, right? Like I knew what good looked like and where we needed to go and how fast we needed to go there because I had seen all of the mistakes be made predominantly at Uber. So, one thing that's particularly unique about Klikit, we are multi-currency, multi-language, multi-time zone, basically from day zero. There are very few SaaS companies in this entire region that sit even within that profile. Big examples, certainly some Australian examples, Employment Hero still isn't available in multiple languages, right? I just use them as an example. But, these are big decisions that come much later in a company's life cycle. One of our biggest, I guess, competitors, Toast in America, fantastic business, have built an incredible product and truly a great suite of products, which now, we have a lot covered. For Toast to now think about how to localize that system with that many variables and that many things, like I shudder to think of the cost and the headache, right? So back to your question, I think I'm not a technical founder, but I knew what good looked like. And so, when I made the decision to start Klikit, I approached some of those engineers who I'd worked exceedingly close with during my days in Bangladesh. And I had said to them, I have this vision. I think I know what good looks like. Will you join me on this journey? And so I was fortunate that I had built up that kind of trust with those people and that they did join me to start the company.
And so, maybe sort of changing gears a little bit, if you think about the space at the time, I mean, it wasn't as if it was a complete white space, that there was no one doing this, right? Even in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific generally, because a lot of the folks that you would have worked with at organizations like Uber or similar organizations had felt similar pain points as well. And so, it's an interesting, I guess, example of notwithstanding there is already emerging competition and some established in other markets, you decided to go for it. how do you reconcile that? What was the framework to say, well, I'm still going to jump into this, notwithstanding that I know that it's probably going to be a space that does become competitive over time?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Ben. I think for me, I'd worked at so many of these different online food marketplaces, and then sort of by extension had also experienced working with a lot of these point of sale companies. And I knew that the space was just hyper fragmented. And so, I still think my underlying thesis was, whether or not there's any real competition today, in my mind, didn't matter so much. What actually mattered is if you think about who will be able to solve this problem, not just for Indonesia, not just for Singapore, but indeed the entirety of Northeast, Southeast Asia, that's a very small amount of founders. And I thought that I had the best shot at doing that because of my background, because of my network, because of who I'd worked with, because of all the experience, this cumulative sum of things. For another to do that, I think would be very, very difficult. They would need to have a comparable or similar background to get that done. And so that's why I still had, and still to this day, have huge conviction on what we're building, scaling, and doing at Klikit.
I think as you've gone through like the Klikit process, right? Like you've obviously iterated, maybe, you've started with FMB and maybe those use cases have expanded over time. Can you maybe just talk through like how that has evolved? Because I think the challenge is like, you've obviously got to be local for specific markets. Like you have to be local for Philippines and you have to be local for Indonesia, but you are a regional business, right? So how does that work internally at Klikit to make sure the product is local and relevant, but also still being like a regional business?
Yeah, I think great question. So, when we started our product, all we were doing was online ordering consolidation and menu management, which is arguably the hardest part of the problem. So we started with the hardest part first. And then over time, we recognized that more and more people loved using our software and wanted to use it for more varied applications. They started saying, hey, can you do reservations? Or hey, can you do own channel delivery? Hey, can you do this? Can you do that? And so, when I first entered this game, I'd initially thought, no hospitality operator wants to have the conversation, do you want to replace your POS? And what I found out was that when you talk to them enough, sure enough, they do. They're like, I don't want this. Like, I want something else, or I want one single system to do all these things. And so then, to the second part of your question, Alex, like about how we do this at Klikit, specifically given we operate in all these different markets and regionally, we have a very tight sort of engineering and product framework that we use and apply at the company. We are shipping product and code every 2 weeks. And so, Sam Altman has always said that the success of a company can basically be traced to how fast it ships. And so as part of that process, what we need to do is we need to stack rank all of these different competing possibilities and these different things, maybe localization issues, maybe an entirely new feature set, whatever it might be. And we need to rapidly find overlaps between markets that can cumulatively unlock value. So that's how things get prioritized. Now, maybe in some markets, there might be some really big thing. So for instance, in Indonesia, maybe it's conducting integration with CIMB Niaga, right? A bank. That's a big Indonesian lift project, but it unlocks a ton of opportunities for the country. And so it's just about stack ranking and weighing those up with your country teams and ideally with all of your sort of country leaders so that there is visibility from other markets that, hey, we need to use resources on this particular initiative now, but later on our stuff's going to get prioritized.
So you start Klikit, you're on that journey, you're a solo founder, to be correct. And you start to think, hey, there's actually signs of PMF and I can really make this work. You need to raise capital. I'm assuming you don't have a personal balance sheet that you can scale something this ambitious just yourself. Talk about the decision to think about venture capital as a way to accelerate that and the process. How did you go about it? What did you need to have to be able to be successful in actually attracting capital? Obviously, you have a really interesting background, but as many founders find out, raising capital isn't just, I've done something interesting now, I'm going to go take millions of dollars in. It's quite a journey.
Yeah, I think like for me, the decision to raise capital was like a fairly obvious one. I think that, at the moment, given the sort of capital cycle, there's a big sort of flavor of the month that says, hey, you should bootstrap these businesses, acquire the first couple of few customers and do all that sort of stuff. And I think that for a lot of, in particular, SaaS companies, I think that is a great approach. The reality for Klikit is like we are playing a multi-country, multi-product game of warfare. And so, if you think that a business like Toast is valuable, well, imagine it all over Asia, right? And so to your point, Ben, you need to be ambitious in how you raise capital. And so when I thought about that, I was able to sort of, I think, do two things well. The first is all the time that I spent in Bangladesh, part of that I was fundraising. And so I was building a personal network of investors. They were interacting with me, and I was fortunate in the sense that they all kind of knew who I was because I seemed like this insane Australian guy who was living in Bangladesh and who just kept raving about how amazing this country is.
Leaves a mark.
It leaves a mark, exactly. And so, in that sense, I was memorable, right? And I think that that's an important thing. Like when you meet investors and you have conversations with investors, you really want to leave an impression on them. And, sometimes you leave a really, really good impression or sometimes you leave a really, really bad one. When I say you leave a really, really bad impression, that doesn't necessarily mean that your access to their capital is cut off. It just might mean that they're like, ooh, that's like a bit interesting, like the way that he talks and the way that, he speaks. And that's certainly the second thing I was able to do. When I would talk with investors, I would lay out all of the things or some of the things that we have talked about today in terms of my thesis. And I would be very upfront with them. I would set the expectations and say, if you do not agree with one part of this thesis, then why are we having a conversation, right? And I'm happy to convince you, right? But fundamentally, if you don't agree with these things, then we shouldn't be talking because it's not going to make sense. And so I think then as part of that journey, when I raised the initial pre-seed capital for Klikit, it was predominantly sort of me as a founder, me as like my background. But then very quickly, to raise the seed capital, I needed to execute, right? And I think that execute at the seed level is really about, at least for Klikit, has been how many countries can you get into and get paying customers and what sort of breadth of product can you build? And, that's still the phase we're currently executing. And I think that we are doing it well. And, if we continue to do that at that level of trajectory, then I think a lot of things, will have made sense. But I think in raising capital, founders need to get very clear why they are doing it. And I think that a lot of people fail and fall down because they haven't had this sort of like interior monologue with themselves about like, why am I raising the dollars and what are the dollars for?
Maybe just to expand on that, because by this point, you've got a pretty extensive network across the ecosystem. And so like you would have had these conversations with investors, and there's obviously early stage founders listening to this, right? And they're trying to think through, okay, like how do I drive a fundraising process for my business? What do you think through when you're selecting investors, and how do you think through like composition, right? Like institutional versus strategics, etc.
Yeah. So I think that if you're raising early, we're talking, pre-seed and seed, my single largest piece of advice is find very, very sharp investors who are unafraid or unapologetically going to give you good advice or just their thoughts, right? And so, for early stage founders raising, really find investors that believe in you, but who are equally unafraid to give you their unfiltered opinion on what you should be doing and how you should be doing it. I think then beyond the seed level, the dynamics change a little bit and you start then thinking about strategics. I definitely, I think strategics can be very challenging at the pre-seed and seed because they're a distraction, right? Typically they come attached to an enterprise. The enterprise might want something you're building, but then you're sort of gummed down in these like monstrous teams of bureaucracy and you end up wasting time and maybe building product that you don't need. So I think though, past that point, past the seed point into the more Series A, you can start thinking about strategics, but getting very clear and very tight on what the value exchange is, I think is very important. Otherwise, it's undifferentiated capital.
And so, you raise your pre-seed, right? You start to think about use of funds on that. I imagine a lot of it is I need to hire great people around me to build the product that I want to go and sell. Let's talk hiring, and specifically, what is it that was the best traits of hiring that you made? Like, what have been the people that have yielded for you, and what were their backgrounds or their sort of personality traits? And then two, what's been the hardest hire to make and retain and have part of the organization?
Yeah. I think about this one a lot. And, on other interviews, I've talked a lot about the fact that people are everything, really. So starting with, I guess, what are the traits that I believe, demonstrate success or are good indicators, right? That someone will be successful at a startup. And it's funny because, again, full circle, we've used the phrase a lot, but it's that sense of accountability. It is this deep responsibility that like I have been tasked with something, I will get it done. And if I don't get it done or the outcome or output doesn't materialize, then I will conduct a very clinical post-mortem as to why that didn't happen and what's changing in the future. And so, my greatest hires in that space to date have been, weirdly enough, or maybe not weirdly enough, people who I think I am reminded of like they were me, right? Like they were a very early version of Chris, sometimes maybe a little arrogant, hard worker, want to be a founder. And my pitch to them is always basically the same thing. Hey, I think you're a really smart person and I think that you will go on to found a company, but you have a lot to learn, just like I had a lot to learn. So join me and let's like learn lessons together. And in that process, you will level up to where you want to go. And so I think that I've found great success in hiring just, young people. We're talking either sometimes grads or 1 to 2 years of experience where they are open to being molded and shaped, but equally the sort of, their very sort of base level of programming is, I want to be a founder. I want to change the world. I got something to prove.
But just to touch on that a little bit, I mean, makes sense. How do you interview for that? I mean, you're sitting with someone in a room for 45 minutes a couple of times. How do you tease that out in a way that's going to give you a sense of this is going to be a successful partnership together?
Yeah, and so I think that that's like really hard. I think I got lucky a few times. So, for instance, our first employee, effectively, a guy named Ivan in the Philippines, Ivan Hernandez, he was trying to build something like Klikit. And I had heard about him through an investor, and they had said, hey, there's this young guy in the Philippines. He's trying to build something similar. And I went straight to him. And we had dinner and I said, join me. Learn a lot of lessons. I've got a lot to teach you, but I need your support to get this done. And it's clear you're passionate about the problem space, right? So in that sense, I kind of lucked out on some of them.
Yeah.
For others, I think that it's really about trying to understand their motivations about why they want to join a startup. And so to your point, Ben, like even if you only have 45 minutes, a lot of people ask the question like, hey, what excites you about job X or like job Y? And people are like, wow, I saw a video on LinkedIn. It was amazing. I thought it looked great. Work-life balance was super cool. If you get answers and responses like that, chances are they're probably not going to be a good fit, right? So you really want to try and get this kind of, this deep understanding, like, does the person have something to prove, right? Do they feel like they're owed something? And while maybe some people listening would think, wow, those seem like incredibly like toxic traits, like I don't want to be around those people. Fundamentally, if you want a high sense of accountability, those people drive and deliver those results, right? And on previous podcasts, I've talked about like settlers and pioneers, right? And at some stage of the business, you need pioneers, people who just go straight out into the unknown. You define the boundaries of the problem space. Hey, go explore X, and then you just leave them to their devices to execute. And for other things, you need settlers, right? People that can follow processes, can undertake responsibilities that are well-defined and clearly thought out. So understanding the juxtaposition between those two and like when and what's necessary, I think is also key to getting those right people. To the second part of your question, one of the worst hires and decisions I've made, I think hiring senior people is really hard. And I think it's the single hardest thing I grapple with as a founder, and probably a lot of other founders who are sitting at a similar stage to where Klikit is. I think I don't necessarily have the challenge in the sense that I've got a bunch of co-founders that I need to keep at the company and I need to find roles for them. I've heard from other founders that's very challenging.
Yeah.
But what I have instead is like, there were individuals who were on the journey at Klikit, and I wanted so desperately to force the company into scaling mode and to delegate. And that was a mistake that I made. And so, sharing somewhat vulnerably to the two of you, when I started the journey at Klikit, I was like, I'm a product guy. I love product. I truly love product. I love building product. I love designing product. I don't think I love selling. I had to sell to get investment, right?
Yeah.
But that's a very particular type of selling. That's not selling to restaurant clients in Indonesia.
Yeah.
That's not selling to hawker centers in Singapore. That's not selling to small ramen eateries in Japan, right? And so I had to, I brought someone in to do that stuff too early. And so, it didn't work out for a lot of different reasons. And I think, we parted on very amicable terms, but that let me throw myself back into sales and really like get a passion for it. And so now that's like what I currently spend a lot of my time doing.
I think to maybe just gear shift a bit here, we've got to the stage with Klikit where you post a couple of fundraising rounds, you've built a product post MVP, you're scaling out a team, you have a management team in place. Things are going pretty well to this point. And I just want to kind of touch on, I guess, some recent events that we've spoken about, and that it's maybe a bit difficult sharing, but you want to share this to raise awareness as well. Maybe just provide the audience, what's been happening recently on your side from a personal perspective, and just kind of talk through like what's been happening from that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm always happy to talk about this topic because I think a lot of people don't talk enough about it. So last year I was diagnosed with cancer and had to undergo 2 operations and around 4.5 months of chemotherapy. And so that was a really interesting time for a couple of reasons. The first was that it's fascinating, after you raise money, you get these things called fiduciary obligations. It's not cool. It's not like a prize or anything. But it basically means you have to let the investors know what's happening, right? You have a legal obligation. And so, I had to call a lot of investors and report them the news that I had cancer. And, for some of them, they were, totally unforeseen. 29-year-old gets cancer, has to undergo months and months of chemotherapy. They're saying, hey, man, if you want to wrap this up, you want to, pull the pin on it. We totally understand. This is like a force majeure, like an act of God. We couldn't have seen this. And so we understand your perspective.
Which is a reasonable position.
100% a
take,
reasonable
right?
position.
And it's one out of empathy and, wanting to make sure that you as an individual prioritize the things you need to prioritize, right?
100%. And I think that, for anyone out there listening who might be going through this stuff or might be a founder who's dealing with some unknown health issues, don't for a second think that there's any like level of bravado or anything like it in this. Like, you do what is right for you. And what was right for me at the time was that, I was going to carry on and keep managing the company. I wasn't going to step away from the business. I was going to keep on hammering on because that's kind of how I rationalize the whole process. And that might be a little bit diluted, but that's like my character. That's like my nature. And so, that was a really interesting time for a couple of reasons and a couple of things I want to dig into. I think the first was that, we've talked a little bit about raising capital, and we've talked a little bit about, how do you think about strategics and how do you think about institutions? But fundamentally, you also need to think about investors as people because they are people. Yeah. And you need to think about the types of investors you bring along and how they will respond to events like this. It doesn't happen every day, but it does happen. And so, as part of that journey, I think I was fortunate enough to select some great investors who, yourselves included, who supported me through that journey. And, despite my maybe seemingly hot-headed decision to keep forging along, were there to support me every step of the way. And I had some, deep level of comfort that if I ever, wanted to step away and make that call, that there would have been support for that to happen. So I think that's the first sort of like key point. I think the second point that's interesting about what happened with me is that, the average age at Klikit of employees is effectively 24, 25. And so I'm only a few years older than most of my staff. And so given that I am a solo founder, as you point out, Ben, at the early stages, a lot of people will say the founder is the company. And, I think that what was really interesting for me is that I chose to keep my cancer diagnosis secret from the company. The only people that knew were my general managers and my investors. That was it. And obviously the COO, Stephen Tucker, on the management team. Everybody else didn't have a clue. They just thought, wow, Chris really enjoys wearing hoodies. And he's got he's going bold. He's gone monk mode, I think is what the Gen Zs like to say. And I played it up and I played into it, and I think that's probably a bit of like Aussie larrikinism, a bit of humor. But I did keep it a secret from a lot of the employees because, it's not to say that it's a sign of weakness, but, there are people who have made active trade-offs and choices to be at Klikit to help me realize this vision. And in my own sort of heart and perspective, I needed to still give them this unwavering confidence that like I was there, like that I am the rock and nothing's going to change. And so, I did that all the way up until I had my, final chemotherapy session, and then I did my final round of scans. And then I announced it at the all hands that I had been undergoing that process.
But just maybe to take a step back, I mean, this isn't a 500-person company, right? So I imagine you're still responsible for the leadership and driving meetings and stand-ups and being omnipresent across the organization, right? And so you're having to do this whilst undergoing rounds of chemotherapy. And we've spoken about this offline. I mean, like, how do you manage that? Like, what's the routine? How do you have the energy? Because it's not as though you could just say, well, guys, I'm back to 2 days a week here. If you're going to lean in, you're going to do it to the full degree it requires. How did you manage that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. And I think that, again, for those listening, I don't want anyone to think that, I'm sort of advocating or chanting for some big bravado. I'm just telling you how I personally kind of dealt with these things. So it was interesting. I was at a talk that I was giving at UQ to the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Society. And they, were talking a lot about self-awareness as being something that's really important. And, I think a lot of people these days, therapy is becoming something that a lot of people go to, whether it's for their relationship or their job or these things. And I think therapy is great because it unlocks self-awareness. And that's good for a lot of people. What do you think? What is the opposite?
The opposite of self-awareness.
Yeah, what is the opposite of self-awareness?
You tell us.
Self-delusion.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Self-delusion. And I think for a lot of people, they look at delusion, they think delusion is a really bad thing. And in many cases, it can be, right? It can be really toxic in things like relationships. It can be maybe toxic in the workplace. But delusion also allows you to do things that ordinarily you physically just shouldn't be able to do. The body will follow the mind. And so I think that was one thing that I found incredibly fascinating. I was like, here I'm left with this awful shell, at least for the time being, and this will 100% be a game fought in the mind. And so, I had this incredible self-delusion that I was like, this is just a test put forward for me. It's a test because Klikit's not ready. I'm not ready to go to the next phase. And so I must pass this test. And so I think for me, it was like a great opportunity to just, to reflect and do those things. But yeah, to your point, Ben, I was turning up every day. And I think I almost drove the nurses of the Gold Coast University Hospital chemotherapy ward mad because, it was so many calls and so many strange things I was saying. I provided a lot of entertainment for the ward. They thought it was hilarious because I was sort of the youngest guy there, saying all these weird things with these little AirPods in, roaming around with my, my chemo drip. But it was important for me to do. And I think that, yeah.
But what's interesting is you say self-delusion, but, a lot of research anecdotally suggests that mindset as you're going through something like that and being able to remain positive and remain locked in and focused can potentially have an impact on how that all goes through from a medical treatment perspective. It sounds like you sort of put yourself into a frame of mind, which is, I am going to get through this. I am going to have that positivity. And, hope, we can share, things look good now. You're in remission and, back, heads down, just focused on building, right? Which is awesome.
I think the other thing I would add to what Ben's saying is a quote you said to me a few weeks back, and that is, are you in love with it or are you in love with the idea of it? And that was an approach you took during that time period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've gone on the record to say this like multiple times, and I'll say it professionally and I'll say it personally. I think that it's probably one of the single biggest lessons that you can have in this life. And, there are a lot of people who might be listening to this podcast or might be watching stuff on YouTube or might be consuming all of this content about how awesome and amazing and fantastic it is to be an entrepreneur and to have your own company and to, do all of these incredible things. But the reality is, one, there's a lot of survivor bias in that, right? For every one of these Mark Zuckerbergs, you end up with, hundreds of thousands of failures, right? And so the thing that I do always say to people is that you need to be in love with the idea, not just the idea of it. If you are doing this for personal glory, for personal gain, monetary, financial, if you are doing this because you want to make your parents proud or something like that, I really think there's better opportunities for you out there. If you are doing this because, like me, I had built all of these food delivery platforms, but I felt my work was unfinished and I couldn't let that go. And so that's why I am in love with the idea of it, because I need to finish the task that I started. It is not all of the other stuff that sort of sits on the outer edges. It truly is an obsession around the problem and getting solutions for customers that work. And so I think that also contributed to that mindset that allowed me to push through.
We've got to close off shortly, but a couple of final questions. Where is Klikit in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think that Klikit, in 5 to 10 years will be the preeminent system to sell almost anything online. I think at the moment we do hospitality, but we're already getting interest from customers across a range of other different segments. And, I think Y Combinator themselves has said that, we need the next generation ERP systems that will power a lot of these sort of digital native businesses or businesses looking to become digital native from their analog past. And additionally, I think that Klikit will finally realize on its vision of what it means to connect creators in kitchens, which was something that was, many people probably think, it's something he's left by the wayside or he's not interested in anymore. But it was something that I raised my initial pre-seed on. And, to all those listening, something's cooking in the kitchen.
Final one from me is a lot of advice, a lot of great learnings out of this. But if there's one message that you think of the entire journey you've been on, that you would want to impart in those listening, what is that?
I think it really is that quote. I think it has to be. It has to be, ask yourself, are you in love with it or just the idea of it? Because if you fail that question in business or in love or in life, it causes so much pain. And people will suffer through. But at the end of the day, if they've just misinterpreted their answers, sometimes it's better to go right back, think deeply about it, and then work out where to go from there. But I think that fundamentally captures the single biggest piece of advice I can give young entrepreneurs or anyone listening to this podcast is really take the time to answer that question for you at a very deep level. Because if you fail to do that, and you start, layering on investors, layering on employees, layering on fiduciary obligations, things get messy. You're not winning. So think hard, think long, and, make your answer your own. Don't make it somebody else's.
Chris, like I said at the start, I always come away from a conversation with you feeling super inspired. So thanks again for joining the first. It was epic having you.
No worries. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Chris.